Pokémon Legends Z-A was announced on February the 27th this year, nearly 5 months ago, and we are still yet to receive any new updates, gameplay teasers, trailers, or any information at all about the new game. However, despite this lack of information, we were left with one key teaser at the end of the announcement trailer: the symbol of Mega Evolution. Mega Evolution, of course, was originally introduced in Generation 6 with Pokémon X and Y, and was a massive success, then bleeding into the Gen 6 Hoenn remakes with further designs for those games. This era marked a new trend of glossy battle gimmicks that continued in each subsequent generation, with Z-moves in Gen 7, Gigantamaxing and Dynamaxing in Gen 8, and Terastallizing in Gen 9. And these are all great in their own right, but none have quite captured the imagination or generated the hype quite like Mega Evolution did, which brought so much excitement to the Pokemon community back in 2013. The last time we saw Mega Evolution in the main series was in the 2018 Let's Go games, which are technically Generation 7, and so by the time Z-A releases in 2025, it will have been 7 long years without any new main series Mega content. Naturally, the excitement is being felt throughout the Pokemon community right now. What new Megas will we get? Will we have Megas of actual native Kalos Pokemon? Will there be an expansion on the lore of Megas and how it was discovered? Wait a minute. Will there be expansion on the lore of Megas and how the phenomena was discovered? Could there be another battle gimmick in the ancient times of the Pokemon universe that we can rediscover in Legends Z-A? In this video, we're going to investigate the evidence we have for what potential new gimmick might be coming in Gen 9's Pokémon Legends Z-A. So as many of us know, Pokémon X and Y was a very strong era for Pokémon commercially. Both the original games, X and Y, and the Hoenn remakes, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, are regarded as some of the best games in the franchise, and I think the era really captured a great version of Pokémon visually. They weren't perfect, but they utilised the 3DS platform really well, and moved the franchise on in some really big ways mechanically. X and Y specifically introduced some really interesting themes with the story of the 3,000-year-old man AZ, the box legendaries being the bringers of life and death, and some really cool Easter eggs that are still unsolved. So just before Pokémon Sun and Moon were announced in 2016, many of us thought that Pokémon Z would be the game to be released and see us out of the handheld era before handing over to the Switch, tying together some of the unanswered questions, like how does Zygarde fit into the wider lore of Kalos and the Pokémon universe? Was Volcanion meant to be an overworld legendary in the power plant? And if I'm not the one, then who is? But Pokémon Z never came. However, all the evidence points to the fact it was planned at some point, but was seemingly parked in favour of a new generation coming out. And that means Pokemon have been working on more subplots that were meant to be in the ultimate Z version of the Kalos story. There will have been a whole host of internal discussions and plans taking place in the background since the game was in development, which is 12 or 13 years at this point. And hopefully all of those ideas are going to come to fruition in Z-A. So what are these themes that were planned for Pokemon Z that we're likely to end up seeing in Z-A? Well, if you look closely at the themes of X and Y, there is a very clear idea resonating throughout the story, and even manifesting in the Pokemon designs themselves: natural versus man-made. In fact, this is a theme that has been around long before Gen 6. If you just look at the Gen 1 Pokédex, you have some very obvious natural Pokémon: Pidgey, Rattata, Goldeen, Venonat, the list goes on. But then you also have some very obviously artificial Pokémon as well. Porygon, described in Gen 1 Pokédex entries as a man-made Pokémon capable of freely navigating cyberspace. Eevee, with its unstable genetic code, insinuates some sort of human manipulation could be at play. And even Pokemon like Hitmonchan is said to embody the spirit of a pro boxer, and Kadabra is said to be a human boy that had psychic abilities and turned into a Pokemon. And Mewtwo is perhaps the most high-profile example of a man-made Pokemon, and we'll come on to that later. So it's very clear that there are all sorts of things happening in the Pokemon universe and all sorts of ways that Pokemon come to be, both naturally and artificially. Fast forward to Gen 7, and something interesting happens to one of the Gen 6 starters. Greninja gets an ability called Battle Bond. This ability is, to this day, exclusive to Greninja, and enables Ash Ketchum to fuse with Greninja, improving its base stats and the power of its signature move Water Shuriken. For the anime, this was done in a spectacular way, and created a real wow moment, but looking back, the way it was implemented into the games was very clunky. Firstly, the only way you could get Ash Greninja is if you completed the Sun and Moon playable demo on the 3DS and transferred it through Pokemon Bank. Secondly, Ash Ketchum technically isn't in the video game universe. He's an anime exclusive character. So the fact that you, as the Sun or Moon protagonist for example, could get Greninja to fuse with Ash Ketchum, who doesn't actually exist there, was kind of weird from a coherent world building perspective. And Pokemon have since retconned the ability as of Gen 9, now making it function in a similar way to Moxie, whereby if a Battle Bond Greninja knocks out another Pokemon, it no longer undergoes the Ash Greninja transformation, but rather boosts its attack, special attack, and speed stats by one stage. So Pokemon have clearly realised something wasn't quite right about the way it was implemented, and wanted to change the way Battle Bond is implemented in the game universe. Enter Pokémon Legends Z-A. Yes, I believe that Battle Bond will be a rival mechanic to Mega Evolution, one of which being aligned with a natural way to get a power boost in battle, and one being an artificial way of doing so. Now I honestly don't know which way around this would go. I guess it could technically work either way, but going off what we know so far, I think it probably makes more sense that Mega Evolution is a man-made process and Battle Bond is more of a natural process. But how it's actually implemented from a lore perspective will of course be up to the writers, and hopefully will end up being something that makes this game really cool. After all, Mewtwo is able to achieve 2 exclusive different types of Mega Evolution, which is interesting as it's a man-made Pokemon, created as a more powerful clone of Mew by Team Rocket using the scientists on Cinnabar Island. And the technology they used also seems to be how they are able to resurrect fossils on Cinnabar Island and restore them to living Pokemon, perhaps using the life energy of the life Pokemon Xerneas. Perhaps the trees that we've seen in Gen 8 and 9, which appear to be trees of life in some capacity, could be linked to Xerneas and this life energy that we're hypothesizing. You can see how there are ways this can all be tied together. Did Giovanni's Team Rocket and his team of scientists figure out how to harness this life energy and use it as part of the process when cloning Mew and creating Mewtwo, an artificial version of it? Is this artificial versus natural theme one of the reasons for the 3,000-year-old war that is depicted in Pokemon X and Y? Perhaps different groups of scientists independently found ways to fuse Pokemon and use this life energy. Take Bill in Gen 1 for example. Before you've barely had a chance to get Kanto's second gym badge, Bill manages to transform himself into a Pokemon using a machine he'd built in his house on the Cerulean Cape. This is a really major example of something like Battle Bond in the first few hours of the first Pokemon games that ever existed, and it hasn't really been elaborated on. So Bill could be a really important character both for the wider ZA story if we see Battle Bond utilised, and possibly for a future Legends, Johto or Celebi game, as he did of course create the time capsule in Gen 2 and he's responsible for the Pokemon storage system. This guy knows a lot about the energy and technologies in the Pokemon universe and how they can be utilised, but perhaps we'll zone in on that theme in another video. And of course, this is all speculation and educated guessing, but there is something in the ZA announcement trailer that really convinced me that something like Battle Bond might come to the surface as a mechanic. The trailer very heavily references harmony, bonds, and specifically a vision of beautiful coexistence between people and Pokemon. During the trailer, the imagery of humans and Pokemon interacting with one another within Lumio City plays into this theme, and a Battle Bond-like mechanic would be a really fitting way to explore this, especially as Ash Greninja is the only example of this to date. Unless of course you count AZ's Floette, which is technically programmed into X and Y, but didn't end up being usable. There are other subtle implications to this in the Pokemon universe. For example, in the anime, Meowth has always been able to speak human language, but the explanation that he learned human language fluently to impress a female Meowth seems a bit far-fetched for a normal type pre-evolved cat Pokemon, and so it's plausible that some sort of human intervention or influence could be at play there as well. And yes, I know the anime is different from the games, but Pokemon have very clearly been trying to make coherence between the anime and the main series of games for some years now. And the different Pokemon universes are constantly drawing inspiration from each other, so it's an interesting one to think about. Especially because of the final piece of evidence I wanted to discuss in this video. The Indigo Disc's Synchro machine. This device enables you to fuse your mind with your Pokemon, and then allows the player to control the Pokemon itself. Now, quite often, towards the end of a Pokemon game, Game Freak will experiment with a concept they're planning for the next game. We saw this with the Pony Wilds, serving as a mini wild area at the end of Alola, the theme of battle styles in the Isle of Armor that ended up being a battle gimmick in Legends Arceus, and with raids in the Pokemon Go universe that ended up being in Sword and Shield, to name a few. And I think the Synchro machine could well be an experiment that fully manifests itself as a fully fledged Battle Bond gimmick in Legends Z-A, and in Gen 10 and beyond. Maybe a permanent feature in the Pokemon series that enables you to physically control both your trainer and your Pokemon if you want to. Imagine having the option to physically navigate a battle against a gym leader, for example, controlling your Pokemon, dodging and using different buttons to select moves. It would almost be a fusion between traditional Pokemon mechanics and something like Pokken Tournament, except you could control every Pokemon. But before I get ahead of myself, let me know what you think about this theory. Will Z-A focus on Mega Evolution and expanding it, or do you think something like Battle Bond could also come back in a bigger way? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments section, and until next time, love you gang.